It's lovely to be with you all this evening. So I'm Lee Chambers. I run a company called Essentialized Workplace Wellbeing, and my journey with masking is an interesting one. In a very similar way to David, I spent 36 years undiagnosed, and in some ways unaware, but always behind the scenes, understanding and knowing that I was distinct in the way that I approached the world. For me, as a young black male growing up on a council estate in England, it was a tough upbringing, and I was seen as a troublemaker in my early years. I was in trouble at playgroup, in trouble at nursery, seen as disruptive, and that presented its own set of challenges because I was also, as a young child, trying to find my identity in a world that didn't really understand who I was. For me, I remember lots of parts of my childhood, very strong emotional memories that I could transport myself back to now and live as if I was actually there as a young boy in the world that I was in. But for me, one of my strongest interests is people. And that strong interest meant that as a young boy, I would watch people. I would try to decode how people behaved. I would try to watch how they interacted. I would watch how they moved their bodies, how their senses changed, how they would connect with other people, how they would communicate, and started almost trying to build myself an encyclopedia of people in my life and how they acted, the interests that they had, the things that seemed to get them to interact and change. And I effectively started to become a carver of masks of my own, masks for the different people I interacted with in my own life. And this was something that left me in many ways quite tired as a youngster, trying to continually document and evolve these masks as the people around me grew up and changed as well. And for me, it was almost a compulsion to be able to do that, alongside the fact I was having to suppress lots of part of myself to try and fit in. I still have the sounds of adults in my life saying, Lee, don't do that. Lee, don't do that. Lee, stop doing that. Lee, please don't do that. And the sensory challenges I had around food and around touch were difficult to mask. I would be tickled until I urinated. I would try to eat foods that I couldn't sensorily deal with the texture and try to force myself. But times I would try and hide and move away. But in school dinner halls, that's very difficult to do. Some of the masking became almost a way of being me and started to kind of remove my own and strip my own identity away from me, where I actually became a chameleon of masks that I would wear in different situations, trying to find some space to fit in, but constantly scrambling for the mask for this place and feeling like I was fumbling and not really sure who I was. And this became more prevalent. I couldn't both keep up the mask wearing and keep up with the suppressing the elements of myself. I would chew my finger until the skin started to fall off. And ultimately, as a child, there was very little that I understood. I never heard about neurodiversity. I just knew that, did everyone live like this? At some points when I was younger, I thought everyone did. I thought this must be everyone's existence, trying to mask for different situations, the constant self-talk to try and validate the position that you were in. And I got to my teenage years and it became even more difficult to control as my hormones fluctuated. But like many teenagers do, didn't want to not fit in a time when we're trying to find our identity. So I actually masked even more and actively tried to suppress my stimming, actively tried to fight through my sensory challenges, fought against myself every single day to try and mask and not stand out too much. I already had an element of diversity and something that stood me out, being a young Black man who was academically seen as gifted, who didn't fit the stereotype of being a gangster, of being trouble. I tried to move away from the stereotypes, but ended up masking myself into a place where I didn't really know who I was or what I stood for. But I took my parents' guidance to try and get a good education and then build a career, would be a way to become socially or economically stronger and also more socially mobile. And going to sixth form was a real challenge because of the variety of social groups and a constant fight to try and find where I belonged, because I was still passionate and infused and interested in how people worked. And that compulsion to mask, because of the strong interest that I had, meant that I lived every day as a paradox, trying to fit in somewhere. And that led me to getting to a point at 17 where life's freedoms started to come. And I was outside of rigid educational institutions and further away from my parents' influence. And that just led me to start to fall apart in many ways, because I had no fabric of identity. I just had an empty vessel and a collection of masks. But somehow I managed to pull that big sack of masks to university with me and became the first one in my extended family to ever go, with all the pressure that was put on me to be an example to my cousins, my friends, and my younger brothers. And yet the pressures of university and trying to keep the mask, moving to a new city, trying to engage in university life, the increased independence, the expectations of my own self-care, lasted 18 months until, facing nothing short of complete autistic burnout, I pretty much give up and locked myself in my university room for 2 weeks until security came, broke me out, and my parents took me home. And reflecting back, I still didn't really know. I just thought that other people must go through this as well. This must be everyone else's existence, surely. I feel different. Do I fit in? Well, somewhere. But that year spent at home trying to build some understanding, I started to see some chinks of light. I started to realize that actually the reason why things had got so bad is because I had no understanding of myself. I had no sense of true identity. I had nothing to attach to. I felt like a log floating down a river with no roots placed, just absolutely left to the tide. And yet somehow I managed to start to form some kind of sense of self in that period. And I went back to university and tried to solely focus on achieving what I'd intended to set out. And I managed to do that and graduate. And somehow managed to mask my way through interviews to get on a graduate scheme. And I'd got to a point where a girlfriend had given me a book. That book said, How to Be Confident. And I read this book, and this book talked about body language, eye contact, making your voice more engaging, and all the things that people had suggested in the past that I was weak at. So I started to actively mask even more from a book. And what that did is it gave me a veneer of credibility almost. However, I went to work for this financial organization, and it was possibly the worst 6 months of my life. I couldn't fit into a corporate structure that had expectations. I suddenly had to try and curate masks for 200 people. Didn't have enough hours in the day to get my chisel out and do that. Never mind start to lift them up and try and switch them. And that was tough. And luckily I was made redundant before I decided to leave, because I was struggling to eject myself. I was just trying to fit in. I was just trying to live the contract that society had put there, that you get a good education and then you get a good job and you get a profession and you get promoted and you build a life. And back home, again, sleeping on my parents' floor because they'd sold their house and decided that they didn't think I was coming back. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. But I then started working in local government and found it just as frustrating, but realized that I had to find a way to financially create a life that I could start to find a pathway to become myself. And that led me to starting my first business, which was a video game business. And building that business allowed me to be able to start to be myself. It allowed me the flexibility to go to the supermarket on a Tuesday afternoon when it was quiet. It allowed me to build my life around routines and structures where I had control. And that was good, but it also led to 5 years of becoming quite rigid and very, very used to things being the way that I built them. And I, during that period, in many ways tried to move away from the world that I was surrounded by. I got married and had children in that period, but I created such a small circle so that I could live and start to understand who I was. But the difficulty is that that business was successful. I suddenly ended up in a positive financial situation. I didn't understand how to use that because I still had no identity. And I ended up even more conflicted with my own success chasing me down a hill like a snowball and no ability to stop and really understand who I was. But that moment came 8 years ago when my immune system failed and left me unable to walk and lay in hospital with my physicality stripped away and no masks left to be cultivated or to be put on. I realized that I had to start to think differently. I would need to ask for help and support, the one thing that scared me the most. I would need to start to truly explore who I was, and I wasn't going to be running around anytime soon. So I had the space to do so. And that reflection led to a year getting back on my feet and 4 years spent at home with my children. And that period allowed me to understand more about myself and just start to have me think about how I was distinct and how, in many ways, my children allowed me to start to see things in myself that I didn't understand through the sheer curiosity of children, the questions they ask, and the space they create for us to be present in ourselves. And that ultimately leads me to where I am today. I started a workplace wellbeing business to bring inclusive wellbeing to organizations, to understand that wellbeing is intersectional and that wellbeing is something that everyone should have access to. And yet it was only a year ago that I received my diagnosis and then had a chance to take a seat and reflect back through all the things that I'd been through, the challenges that I'd overcome, the difficult times, the amount of masks that I'd molded and crafted and shaped and honed. And I'm still a year on in a difficult place, trying to unpick all the different aspects, because I held onto those masks so tight, they almost become welded onto my very person. I'm still to this day unpicking some of the fragments of those masks from who I am as someone who works with people on an everyday basis. But ultimately, the journey is massively liberating. I have managed to physically and mentally start to distance from some of those masks that I held onto so dearly. And in the future, that will continue. But the biggest thing for me is to realize that it's something that you don't truly understand until you face stillness. And we don't live in a world that is still. We have to forge that stillness. And I have the added consideration of an autistic son and how I try to support him in understanding that hopefully a world will become more accepting so that masking becomes less necessary. There will be spaces for him to be his authentic self, to bring both the things he is strong and passionate about to the fore, and never have to pretend to be somebody else just to try and get by. So thank you all for listening to me. And we mask in plain sight. And when you've had a mask on, or many masks, and built many, you can almost become a master mask maker. And yet having to detach from that refined skill that we have in itself is like trying to give up a craft that you've spent almost all of your life perfecting and honing and shaping to try and become potentially one of the best maskers in the world. And many of us have to find a way to become a beginner in other aspects of our lives, while also understanding we're amazing individuals and all distinct but brilliant at the same time. Thank you, everyone.